Put that dog down or I'll call animal control. Ma'am, he's literally peeing on my lawn. Disgusting. I'm reporting you to the HOA. That's Karen, our self-appointed neighborhood dictator, screaming at me over a golden retriever. What she didn't know? That disgusting dog would end up revealing her darkest secret. Smash that like button if you've ever met someone who thinks the HOA stands for harass our area. Subscribe for more stories where karma bites back harder than a Labrador with a chew toy. Because this woman tried to poison my dog, and I turned her basement into a manure swamp. The first time I met Karen was on a Sunday morning that smelled like wet grass and quiet peace. I was out front tossing a ball for Max, my golden retriever, who had more personality than most people on our street. The sun was just coming over the maple trees, the kind of morning where you can actually feel the calm. Then, like a scene change in a movie, the peace broke. A voice as sharp as a whistle cut through the air, shouting about something I couldn't quite catch. I turned and saw her, standing on her porch in a pink bathrobe with a clipboard, glaring at me like I'd just keyed her car. She had the look of someone who believed she was born to regulate the universe. You know, she called out, there's a leash length requirement in this community. I looked down at Max, who was happily gnawing on his ball about 3 feet from my leg, and then back at her. He's fine, I said, trying to keep things civil. But civility wasn't Karen's native language. She marched across her lawn in those fuzzy slippers that made squeaking sounds on the dew-soaked grass, clutching her clipboard like it was a weapon of righteousness. Dogs are not permitted to relieve themselves within 20 feet of another residence, she declared, as if she were quoting scripture. I should have laughed. Instead, I apologized and led Max back toward the driveway, thinking that would be the end of it. But that was just the opening act. By the next morning, there was a bright yellow envelope taped to my mailbox. HOA violation notice, written in big, bold letters. My offense? Failure to comply with pet waste management standards. I actually reread it 3 times because it didn't even sound like real English. Apparently, Karen had decided that my dog's mere existence was an environmental hazard. Over the next few days, she escalated like she was training for the Entitlement Olympics. I'd catch her snapping pictures of my front yard, crouching near the sidewalk, like some kind of wildlife photographer. Every time Max barked at a squirrel, she'd jot something down on her clipboard. I started getting notices for things that didn't exist: excessive noise disturbance from animal activity and unapproved lawn ornaments. The unapproved ornament, in this case, was Max's water bowl. I tried to ignore her, but ignoring Karen was like ignoring gravity. She found new ways to pull you back into her orbit. Then came the meatballs. I didn't see her throw them at first. It was just one of those mornings when I noticed something odd in the grass, small, round pieces of meat scattered near the fence. Max trotted over, tail wagging, and I might not have thought twice if the smell hadn't hit me a faint chemical tang beneath the beef. I called him back immediately and picked one up with a glove. Inside, the meat was a blue-green, crumbly substance that looked like grains of rice. I didn't need a lab test to know it was poison. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I called animal control, who took samples and confirmed my suspicion. Rat poison, the kind that causes internal bleeding. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time Max sighed beside the bed, I'd check to make sure he was breathing. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to understand what kind of person looked at a friendly, harmless animal and decided it deserved to die just because it occasionally barked. The next morning, I confronted her. She was pruning her perfectly symmetrical hedges like a villain in a soap opera. I held up one of the poisoned meatballs in a plastic bag. "You threw these into my yard," I said. She didn't even blink. She looked at the bag, then at me, and said with absolute calm, "If people controlled their animals properly, they wouldn't have accidents like that." That sentence replayed in my mind long after she walked away, clippers snipping rhythmically as if she hadn't just admitted to a felony. I realized then that Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time. She was something worse, a person who believed her personal preferences were the law of the land. She'd convinced herself that she wasn't the villain, that she was protecting the sanctity of the neighborhood from chaos, one poisoned meatball at a time. I stood there watching her trim those hedges, my fists clenched, and made a silent promise to myself and to Max. If she wanted a war, she had just declared it. After that morning, I realized Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a strategist. Every move she made was deliberate, calculated, and wrapped in the thin paper of self-righteousness. I spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief, alternating between anger and caution. The local animal control officer had been sympathetic but helpless without video proof. He told me she could easily claim she was just feeding strays. That word stuck with me, proof. Proof was what she had always used against everyone else. Pictures, notes, false violations. So I decided it was time she became the subject of her own surveillance. I spent a weekend turning my backyard into something that looked ordinary, but wasn't. The birdhouses now held small cameras, the porch light had a hidden lens, and even the garden gnome by the hydrangeas had a new set of eyes. Every corner of my property watched quietly. I felt a little paranoid doing it, but I reminded myself this wasn't paranoia. This was protection, and I didn't have to wait long for results. On the third night, just as dusk turned everything blue, I saw her. Karen slipped out of her house, holding something in her hand, and walked toward my fence. Her face was half hidden by the brim of her visor, and she moved with the exaggerated care of someone who thought they were invisible. She crouched, tossed something over, and walked away humming to herself. The next morning, I checked the footage. There she was, tossing another handful of poisoned meatballs, smiling as if she was dropping breadcrumbs for birds. Watching that clip made something click inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was purpose. I sent the footage to the HOA board and waited for a reaction. Surely, this was the kind of undeniable evidence they couldn't ignore. But when I received their response 2 days later, I realized how deep her influence ran. The email was polished and polite, thanking me for bringing my concerns to their attention, but they claimed there was insufficient evidence to link her actions to malicious intent. They suggested that misunderstandings between neighbors often arise from differing interpretations of property boundaries. It was a masterpiece of corporate nonsense that might as well have been written by Karen herself. It took me less than a day to find out why. During one of her morning lectures to the mailman about parcel placement policies, she mentioned her boyfriend, Mark. I didn't think much of it until I remembered the name of the HOA president printed on every notice I'd received. Mark Jennings. Suddenly, everything made sense. Karen wasn't just violating the rules, she was rewriting them from the inside. I pictured the two of them sitting together, sipping coffee and drafting citations like they were love letters. The realization made my stomach twist. Meanwhile, the fines kept coming. Non-compliant pet containment, unauthorized fencing, visual clutter visible from street view. Each one was more absurd than the last, and each one came with a smiley face drawn in the corner, as if she wanted me to know it was personal. I tried reasoning with her once more, standing at the edge of her perfectly edged lawn, but she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "If you can't follow community standards," she said, "you might not belong in this community." That night, I sat on my porch staring out over the neighborhood she thought she owned. Every mailbox looked identical, every lawn trimmed to the same sterile perfection, and every house dark except for hers. The windows glowed with that artificial warmth that hides rot underneath. I wondered how many other neighbors had suffered in silence under her paper tyranny. How many had paid the fines, cut their grass to her standards, apologized for things they didn't do just to avoid her wrath. Then Max came and rested his head on my knee, tail thumping gently against the porch. His trust was absolute, unbroken by what had happened. That's when I knew what I had to do. Karen believed power came from fear, from rules and paperwork and fake authority, but real power came from patience, from knowing when to let your opponent build their own trap. I looked at the glowing windows of her house and made another silent promise. She had declared war on my dog, my peace, and my home. It was time to show her that I could fight back in ways she would never see coming. The footage, the fines, the lies, they weren't the end of her story. They were just the setup. What she didn't know was that her arrogance had already given me everything I needed. She'd shown me exactly where her weakness was. It wasn't her clipboard or her position. It was the simple belief that nobody would ever stand up to her. And that belief, I decided, was about to drown in its own poison. The plan didn't come to me all at once. It started as a joke muttered over a beer with my friend Tyler, who worked at a landscaping supply company. He'd heard me rant about Karen before, and when I showed him the footage of her poisoning Max, he stared at the screen for a long time before saying, "You know, manure is really cheap in bulk." I laughed at first, but the thought wouldn't leave my head. It followed me through the next week, replaying every time I saw her smug face at the end of the street, pretending she didn't know what she'd done. There's a special kind of calm that comes over you when you realize the best revenge doesn't have to be violent or illegal. It just has to be poetic. Karen's house sat slightly lower than mine on the street, her basement extending beneath ground level. During spring, the rainwater that rolled off the hills behind my property always found its way toward her yard. She had spent months bragging about her state-of-the-art French drain system and her self-sustaining irrigation upgrades. I remembered her words almost word for word, because she'd cornered me one morning to describe the details I hadn't asked for. As I looked out at my yard that afternoon, I realized that what she'd built wasn't just a bragging point, it was a highway. A channel connecting her basement to the water flow that began on my side. The next step was simple in theory, though it required a little subtlety. Tyler owed me a favor, and I asked if he could arrange a delivery for organic fertilizer to my property, 6 tons of it. The truck showed up 2 days later, right around the time Karen was pruning her rose bushes. She came strutting over, phone in hand, ready to document whatever violation she imagined I was committing. "What exactly is that?" she asked, nose wrinkled. "A natural soil amendment," I said, trying not to smile. She recorded the whole thing, muttering something about potential contamination. I waved, thanked the driver, and watched her retreat, satisfied she'd caught me in some kind of environmental scandal. That night, after she'd gone inside, I worked quietly by the fence with a flashlight wrapped in red cellophane to keep it dim. The drainage line that connected my property to hers ran just under the fence, and a few careful adjustments with my shovel redirected the slope slightly. It wasn't enough for anyone to notice, but enough for runoff to follow gravity's new invitation. Then I attached the flexible hose from the delivery tank to the drainage cap, sealing it with duct tape and a prayer. The system was elegant in its simplicity. When my sprinklers ran the next morning, so did the manure. I didn't expect results overnight. Revenge, like compost, needs time to settle. But on the 3rd morning, I woke to the sound of yelling carried on the wind. It was the kind of yell that starts in disbelief and ends in despair. I peeked through the blinds just as Karen came bursting out her back door, hair tangled, feet bare, waving her arms in panic. Her pristine white patio had turned brown, streaked with runoff that looked like melted chocolate but smelled like something that belonged nowhere near a breakfast table. The drainage system she'd bragged about had backfired in spectacular fashion, channeling liquefied manure directly into her basement. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood was buzzing. A biohazard cleanup truck parked in her driveway, men in masks hauling out rolls of carpet wrapped in plastic. From what I overheard, the entire lower floor had flooded before she even noticed. The smell traveled faster than gossip, and by the evening, every open window on the street carried a reminder of poetic justice. I kept a straight face when I waved to her that night, as she stood in her driveway, covered in flecks of mud and fury. She didn't wave back. I didn't feel triumphant right away. Watching her house become a disaster zone brought a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt guilty, another part relieved, and somewhere deep down there was satisfaction so pure it made my hands tremble. Tyler called later that night, laughing so hard he could barely talk. "Dude," he said, "it's all over the community Facebook page. They're calling it the Great Manure, Flood of Maple Ridge." I couldn't help but laugh too, because it was perfect. Karen, the queen of cleanliness, the self-proclaimed guardian of property values, had been dethroned by the very earth she tried to control. The next morning, I took Max for a walk. The air still held a faint trace of her disaster, but it smelled like freedom to me. He trotted happily beside me, tail wagging, unaware of the chaos that had restored our peace. When we passed Karen's house, she was sitting on her porch surrounded by buckets and rubber gloves, staring into the distance like someone who'd just learned the universe keeps score. For the first time since moving in, she didn't say a word. I tipped my hat and kept walking, letting the silence speak for both of us. By the following week, the smell had mostly faded, but the story hadn't. News travels differently in a small neighborhood. It doesn't move in straight lines or through official channels. It weaves through porch conversations, whispered phone calls, and group texts filled with speculation. Everyone knew something had happened to Karen's house, though not everyone knew exactly what. Some said it was a sewage backup, others claimed her sprinkler system malfunctioned, and a few whispered theories about divine punishment for her endless crusade against pets, paint colors, and patio furniture. Karen tried to control the narrative, but But you can't control what people want to believe, and everyone wanted to believe the queen of the HOA had finally met her karma. Still, she wasn't the type to surrender quietly. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too small and carrying a thick binder labeled property damage claims. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, as if she'd bathed in bleach before showing up. Her boyfriend, Mark, the HOA president, sat at the front table looking like a man who had aged a decade in a week. When I walked in, a few neighbors nodded at me with small smiles that felt like private congratulations. Karen shot me a look so sharp, I almost felt it. The meeting started with routine topics about landscaping budgets and upcoming maintenance projects, but everyone knew what we were really there for. Eventually, Karen stood, dramatically clearing her throat. "I have a matter of personal importance to address," she said, opening her binder with the flair of a courtroom lawyer. "My home was deliberately sabotaged. My property was vandalized through an act of malicious environmental contamination, and I believe the perpetrator is present in this room." Her eyes locked on me. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Mark tried to intervene, suggesting they discuss it privately, but she waved him off and continued. "For years, I've dedicated myself to maintaining the integrity of this neighborhood. I've enforced the rules everyone agreed to when they moved in. And this," she gestured vaguely, as if pointing at an invisible crime scene, "this is what I get in return." She began to describe the incident in painful detail, talking about the flooding, the damage, and how the cleanup had cost her thousands. People shifted uncomfortably, half sympathetic, half skeptical. Finally, she held up a photograph of the brown-stained basement, and that's when I stood. "I can explain what happened," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But before I do, there's something everyone should see." I pulled my phone from my pocket and connected it to the projector cable dangling from the ceiling. The lights dimmed, and the first frame appeared on the wall behind me. Karen crouched by my fence, tossing the poisoned meatballs into my yard. A murmur ran through the room like wind through tall grass. The next clip showed her returning 2 nights later, doing it again. The final clip caught her laughing as she watched Max bark from behind the fence, completely unaware of the danger. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The silence stretched until one of the board members, a retired lawyer named Patricia, leaned forward and said softly, "That's attempted animal cruelty." Karen stammered something about the footage being fake, but the timestamps matched the dates of my original complaint to the HOA, and the board knew it. Mark looked like he wanted to disappear. I didn't say much after that. I just told them about the weeks of harassment, the false citations, and the constant surveillance. I reminded them that every fine, every violation, had come from her office, often without approval from the rest of the board. When I finished, I played the recording of my earlier conversation with the animal control officer, confirming the poison. The evidence spoke for itself. Patricia turned to the rest of the board. Given the gravity of this, I motioned to remove Miss Campbell from her position, effective immediately. The vote wasn't even close. Every hand except Mark's went up. Karen's breath hitched like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. For years, she had controlled this neighborhood with threats of fines and letters typed in bold. Now, the power she'd clung to so fiercely was gone. She tried one last time to salvage her image, accusing me of fabricating everything out of spite. But the look in everyone's eyes told her the fight was over. People she had bullied for years finally saw her for what she was. When she realized no one was going to defend her, she gathered her papers with trembling hands and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the projector flickered. The room stayed quiet for a long time after she left. Someone coughed. Then Patricia turned to me and said, "I think this neighborhood owes you and your dog an apology." There was a small ripple of laughter, not cruel, just relieved. Mark resigned 2 days later, citing stress. The HOA quietly erased half the rules Karen had invented. That night, as I sat on the porch with Max at my feet, the air smelled clean for the first time in months. Across the street, Karen's house was dark, except for a single light in the basement where workers were still cleaning. It struck me that justice doesn't always come from courts or police reports. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a projector screen, and the truth everyone has been too afraid to say aloud. The weeks that followed felt different, as if the whole neighborhood had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The street was quieter in the best way. No more anonymous notes tucked under windshield wipers. No more passive-aggressive flyers about lawn height or recycling habits. People began stepping outside again, actually talking to one another. The mailman even lingered long enough to chat with a few residents at the corner, something I hadn't seen him do since Karen's reign of clipboard terror began. It was strange how quickly normalcy returned once fear was gone, like sunlight pouring into a room that had been shuttered for years. Karen's house, however, was a different story. The basement cleanup had taken longer than anyone expected. She'd tried hiring 3 different companies, but the stench never really disappeared. Word spread fast that the damage had gone deeper than surface level. The manure water had seeped into the foundation, and every time it rained, the smell returned as if the earth itself refused to forget. She tried masking it with lavender oil and lemon candles, but nature has its own sense of humor. Each attempt only made the air around her porch smell like something that belonged in a barn wearing perfume. She started avoiding everyone, sneaking out early in the mornings to retrieve her mail and returning home before dusk. The once immaculate garden she had prided herself on was now a patch of uneven dirt and wilted roses. I sometimes caught glimpses of her through the blinds, pacing near the window, her phone pressed to her ear, probably arguing with yet another contractor or insurance adjuster. For someone who had controlled every square inch of her surroundings for years, losing control must have felt like suffocating. Meanwhile, Max was thriving. He seemed to sense that the air was lighter. His fur grew shinier, his tail wagged faster, and he spent long afternoons sprawled across the freshly mowed grass without a care in the world. The neighbors who had once kept their distance began stopping by to give him treats, as if he had become the unofficial mascot of our quiet rebellion. Every wag of his tail felt like a small victory, a living reminder that peace could return after chaos if you held your ground. About a month later, I came home to find a "for sale" sign planted in Karen's front yard. It stood there, perfectly centered, white letters gleaming against the dull brown of her dying lawn. By evening, half the street knew about it. Some people speculated she was moving out of state. Others said her insurance refused to cover the damage, leaving her with no choice but to sell. I didn't ask, and she never told. A few days later, movers arrived, loading her life into boxes while she stood silently on the porch. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked tired, like someone who had finally realized the fight wasn't worth the cost. When her car pulled away for the last time, the neighbors gathered near the end of the street, pretending not to watch, but unable to look away. There was no celebration, just quiet relief. The power she'd held over everyone had dissolved the moment she left. The new family that moved in a few weeks later brought cookies on their first day and asked about local dog parks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I smiled and pointed them toward the best one, watching as Max sniffed their hands and wagged his tail in approval. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and think about how strange justice can be. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it trickles in like water through soil, quiet but unstoppable. The world has a way of balancing itself, if you're patient enough to let it. Karen believed she was untouchable because she hid behind rules and authority, but all the rules in the world can't protect someone from the consequences of cruelty. She tried to poison a dog to assert dominance, and in doing so, poisoned her own peace. Now the nights are calm again. The sound of sprinklers has returned, steady and harmless. The lawns still shine under the porch lights, but there's a softness to them now, an unspoken agreement that this neighborhood belongs to everyone, not just one person with a clipboard. Max curls up beside me, head resting on my boot, eyes half closed. I can hear the faint chirp of crickets mixing with the ripple of the lake beyond the houses. Every sound feels earned, every quiet moment a reward. I look across the street where her house used to glow with judgment, and see only the warm, flickering light of a family laughing around their dinner table. The smell of fresh soil drifts on the breeze, clean and earthy. It reminds me that sometimes, to grow something good, the ground has to be turned over first. Maybe that's what all of this was, a reckoning that became renewal. The memory of Karen has faded into a story neighbors tell when they need a reminder that even the loudest tyrants fall silent eventually, and in the space they leave behind, life goes on. And that, my friends, is how a golden retriever and a bucket of manure ended a flow neighborhood dictatorship. Proof that sometimes karma doesn't knock, it floods the basement. If you made it this far, you deserve a medal for surviving suburban warfare. Remember, if someone ever messes with your peace, don't stoop to their level. Dig deeper, literally. Hit that subscribe button for more tales of justice served fresh, and drop a comment sharing your wildest Karen encounter. Because if this story taught me anything, it's that HOA power trips may be temporary, but manure is forever.